Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Ray. I'm a detransition male, and today I'm going to be talking about what does it mean to be anti-trans. So I'm going to be reacting to this person, Dr. Jamie. So they have a YouTube channel called Dr. Jamie Talks LGBTQIA plus. And Dr. Jamie says that they are a medical doctor, a board certified psychiatrist, and gender researcher who specializes in gender affirmative care. So this person is transgender, a trans woman, and they have a YouTube channel that is supposed to be on the educational side, talking about the science of gender affirming care, and they're a big promoter of gender identity ideology and all the associated clinical protocols with pediatric gender medicine and all that different stuff. So they're kind of styling themselves as a gender expert, as a gender researcher. They have like the medical credentials to go along with this. So this is not just some like random YouTuber. I found this person is like, you know, saying that they're like an expert and that you should listen to them on this topic. But they did this video called Trans Psychiatrist Discusses 10 Ways to Spot Anti-Trans Trolls Who Say They Are Not Anti-Trans. And I thought this was a good video to respond to because pretty much every single thing they said is like false, or can be taken differently if you have a different worldview perspective. So let's jump right into it. I'm going to react as I go along.
Hey, it's Dr. Jamie. My pronouns are she or they. I'm an associate clinical professor of psychiatry. I am a researcher, and I'm somebody who works in the space of gender affirming care. Welcome back to my channel. So today I wanted to talk about people who say they're not anti-trans, who are really anti-trans. But before we do that, some of you might be asking, has Jamie moved since her last video? And the answer is, not so much. I've pretty much been in this same chair the last 24 hours. I get up to pee and to dilate and to do things like that, but this is what post-op vaginoplasty recovery looks like. One thing I have been doing a lot of is reading. I do recommend this book. It's free to be Understanding Kids and Gender Identity by the lovely Jack Turbin, MD. Dr. Turbin is a gender researcher and gender affirming care provider for youth at UCSF. He and I recently worked on a book chapter for the upcoming edition of Lewis's Child and Adolescent Psychiatry textbook on minority stress in gender diverse youth. So stay tuned for more information on that. We will also be presenting together at the upcoming ACAP conference. So that's the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry conference in October. I will also share more information about that in a future video. But in the meantime, please pick up Dr. Turbin's book if you're interested in learning more about gender affirming care in youth. I will put a link in the description below to where you can buy it. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to talk about people who think that they're not anti-trans, but are actually anti-trans. One thing I've been doing a lot of, sadly, is
Notice how they don't even define what it means to be anti-trans. They just assume we all know what it means to be anti-trans. What does it mean? Are you against the ideology of transgenderism? You like actively hate the individual people? You don't like medical transition? You like social transition? You sort of don't support certain legal rights? I mean, there's so many different ways that that could be like construed, and you might have differing opinions in all this. You might support individuals who are trans. You might support individual transition, but maybe you just don't, you're not on board with like the gender medicine stuff for children, or you support adults being autonomous, but you don't think that they should play sports or whatever. So like there's all this like nuance that can be taken. Yeah, it's all lumped under this general category of anti-trans, and we're never even told what it means to be anti-trans.
I've been on social media a lot, and I'm just amazed. Like people like J.K. Rowling, Elon Musk, Wes Streeting, the new guy who's running the NHS in the UK, they all claim that they're not anti-trans, but they're anti-trans. So I made a list of 10 things that if you do them, support them, believe them, you're probably anti-trans. Okay, so let's just go through them. 1, you vote for people who would take away LGBTQI plus rights. All right, so many of us live in, I'll be honest, fear and anxiety from one election cycle to the next. The reason is that on one side is a candidate who would like support LGBTQIA plus people's rights, and on the other hand, there is a candidate who would take them away. And if you support candidates who would take away the rights of LGBTQI plus people, you can't say that you have like trans or gay friends. You may know a gay or a trans person, but if you vote for somebody who would take away their rights, you are not their friend. And you are also anti-trans. All right.
Okay, so let's break this down. Like what sort of rules or laws are we talking about typically? Typically, we're talking about things like, bathroom bills, we're talking about access to female spaces, we're talking about sports, we're talking about, laws about gender medicine for children. So you can be against gender medicine for children based on the systematic evidence reviews. You can be against transgender women playing sports against females based on the systematic evidence reviews that shows that that's unfair. You can be against the claim that a male-bodied person has an intrinsic legal right to female spaces based on just, an understanding of like ethics and pragmatics and like the importance of maintaining single-sex spaces. You can be against all those different things, and you can still be, not anti-trans. Insofar as anti-trans, in my opinion, means like you hate trans people, you're against trans people, and you don't want them to get the legal entitlements that they are entitled to under a free and fair liberal democratic society where we sort of don't discriminate simply on the basis of their trans. But if you are a male-bodied person, you don't have an intrinsic legal right to go into a female space just because of your identity. If you are a male-bodied person, you don't have an intrinsic legal right to play on the female sports team simply in virtue of your gender identity. If you are a trans child, you don't have an intrinsic right to subpar experimental gender medicine that hasn't been proven in systematic evidence reviews to have the benefits that they're claiming it is. So on like all these topics that they're talking about in terms of like trans rights, oh, if you're against trans rights then you must be anti-trans. No, we have to break it down. What are the specific rights that we're talking about? And in most cases, those rights are premised on the idea that gender identity as a construct is going to replace biological sex as a construct in all legal, social, and ethical domains where it's applicable.
All right. 2, you don't respect trans people's pronouns, gender, or chosen name. This is just about basic respect. If you can't extend basic respect, if you can't use somebody's chosen name and pronouns, not only is that anti-trans, it's just small and rather pathetic, actually. 3,
Okay, so I know I get a lot of flack on my channel for using preferred pronouns sometimes, but I don't think this makes you inherently anti-trans. It just means you have a different philosophical worldview in regards to the political and ethical ramifications of using pronouns that are not matched to the biological sex. And one might have that belief based on a general philosophical ideological worldview that says, one ought to use pronouns that are associated with your biological sex. And that's not specifically out of animus. It's not specifically out of hatred. It's not specifically out of, being anti-trans, but rather the idea behind that position is typically that the downstream consequences of using preferred pronouns leads to things that are themselves bad. So you have a trade-off. Using preferred pronouns, makes this 1% of the population, feel happier. But the downstream consequences is that, that might erode other areas of, discourse or legality, or set up certain precedents in our language that might have negative consequences for, supporting gender identity ideology. But I wouldn't say merely because you use sex-based pronouns, that you're anti-trans, so long as you have a good reason for doing so. And typically that good reason is born out of adherence to a sort of gender critical ideology. And some people, like this person, are going to say that that gender critical ideology is inherently anti-trans, but I would say rather it is a competing philosophical worldview on the topic of sex and gender, and how sex and gender relate to each other, how they ought to relate to each other. And so no, I don't think it's inherently anti-trans.
3, you support restrictions on gender affirming care for minors and adults. So whether it's for minors or adults, we know that gender affirming care saves lives.
No, that is not that's not borne out by the facts. And this person calls themselves a medical doctor, a gender researcher, a expert on gender affirming care. All the systematic evidence reviews don't show that gender affirming care, particularly for minors, saves lives, because this is not cancer treating medication. This is not, you know, like your kidneys aren't going to fail, your livers aren't going to fail, you're not going to develop cancer, you're not going to have a heart attack, you're not going to have a stroke if you don't get this gender affirming care. So the only meaningful sense in which this saves lives is the idea that it reduces the number of self deletions from mental health issues. But all the systematic evidence reviews show that this protocol for minors does not have an impact on the self deletion rate. So this claim that it's like saving lives, it's totally illogical, it's totally political, and it's just an activist slogan that doesn't have any basis in the systematic evidence reviews.
Gender affirming care supporting youth and adults through their gender transitions, through unpacking gender, is the only thing that's been proven to help remove their gender dissonance.
It actually hasn't been proven to remove their gender dissonance, because in the systematic evidence reviews, for example, in the CAST review, when you measure gender dysphoria as one of the variables in regards to this intervention, long term, there's not good evidence. There's weak evidence to show that the transition pathway actually alleviates the gender dysphoria. That is in the systematic evidence. Like,
Okay? So when you restrict access to gender affirming care for minors and adults, you cause them harm and you are anti trans.
it also causes children harm to give them medical interventions that they can't properly consent to, because they are not rational adults. And by not properly consenting to those interventions, particularly if there are radical and irreversible, such as double mastectomy, you're not going to be able to take that back. Or, going on radical interventions like puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, which takes away your ability to decide whether or not you want to have your own biological children. So those are radical interventions, and that is harmful to children. So this claim that, oh, if you are against pediatric gender medicine, it's because you hate these children, that you're against these children. No, the people who are fighting for this, it's because that they have the interest of these children in their mind, because they're trying to do what's best for the children by following where the systematic evidence reviews. When these European countries like Finland and Sweden and the UK are rolling back gender medicine protocols for children, they're not doing so because they hate these children. They're doing it because they have these children's interests in mind, because they're doing what's best for the children by following evidence-based medicine. Following evidence-based medicine is not anti-trans.
Okay. 4, you think teaching kids about gender sexuality is wrong or dangerous. Teaching kids about gender sexuality does not change their orientation or their gender identity. All it does is make them more tolerant, and it makes those kids who are trans or gay not feel shameful about who they are. And that's something that all of us should want. So, again, if you think this is wrong, you're anti trans.
So there's just so many things
Mhm.
to unpack here. But teaching gender identity ideology in like kindergarten or preschool or whatever, or in these schools, that is different than simply acknowledging the reality of that like sex exists or whatever, or teaching children about how to have safe sex, which, I'm not an educator. I don't have children. I'm just saying, like, I'm not saying that, like, nothing about sex should ever be taught in schools whatsoever, but I'm saying, like, that's different than teaching gender identity ideology, which promotes this idea that, this like gender spectrum, genderbread person or whatever, and all these ideas that gender is different than sex, that you have all these variables, and that you have to question your gender all the time. It throws the identities of these children into a state of ambiguity and confusion, such that now we're like teaching children to like question, like, oh, maybe I'm trans, maybe I'm not trans, maybe I like my body, maybe I don't like my body. We are destabilizing their identity by forcing them to engage in these ideological exercises of gender identity theory, which is to promote this idea that we all have gender identities that are disconnected from our bodies. And that if only we explore this self knowledge through these introspective, practices and these rituals of, asking for pronouns and all this different stuff, we're indoctrinating children to pick up on the trend of the non-binary identities, of the trans identities. And it is not surprising that amongst the youth, these non-binary identities, these trans identities, they are rising, because this is a social trend. This is a cultural artifact of the modern 21st century. And this is not some intrinsic thing to who you are. These identities are socially constructed. And they're socially constructed in part due to the ideological educational apparatus that is being injected into our schools, this gender identity theory that's being injected into our schools. So you can have a problem with that ideology and not be anti trans.
All right. 5. You think trans kids or adults should not be allowed to participate in sports that align with their gender identity. So, not allowing kids to participate in sports that align with their gender identity, it's just cruel. We know that allowing kids to participate in sports improves their self esteem and has other positive outcomes. With adults, I, do you know that trans people have been allowed to participate in the Olympics since like almost 20 years ago? So, like, where are all the trans athletes with all the gold medals?
Because up until recently, those Olympic qualifications, you had to have bottom surgery in order to qualify. And the vast majority of transgender women who got bottom surgery are also not elite athletes. And the post recovery capabilities um, are just not really there. So it's not really surprising that until recently, um, the those like restrictions were in place. And so a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the trans women who were able to get bottom surgery and also be elite athletes and also have the money and time to, train to be an elite athlete, they're just not overlapping demographics. But that's not to say that in principle, if an elite athlete is already an elite athlete and then they transition and go on hormones, that they would not have an unfair advantage in virtue of having gone through male puberty. Because all the systematic evidence reviews, as I've gone over on my channel a million times, shows that if you've gone through male puberty, going on the hormone therapy is not enough to negate all the biological advantages that arise from going through male puberty. So, in a matter of fairness, we ought to be, teaching people to accept their biological sex, accept the reality of their sex, and develop sporting policies and fairness policies that are, acknowledging that reality of the biological sex. Which is why different sporting bodies, such as like the swimming and the track sporting body, which is controlled which controls the policies at the Olympic level, have actually banned transgender women from competing in the female sports category by looking at the science. So they have looked at the science, and they're adjusting the policies accordingly to not allow biological females to compete against trans women because it's not fair. As far as children, who are not at the elite level, rather than teaching them that their identity trumps their biological reality, why not just, let them, play on the sports team in like an open category or play with their friends, but not compete. And because it's important to teach children the limitations of competition. Not everyone gets to compete. Not everyone gets to do everything they want just because they have an identity or a feeling. Competition is about fairness. Fundamentally, sports competitions is about fairness. And while yes, it does have, social and pragmatic benefits in terms of, having an after school program, fundamentally, we have to teach kids that life is not fair, and that if you go on to transition, you might not be able to get all your sports needs met. But to accept the biological reality of who you are is like a good, positive, therapeutic thing, rather than teaching people to deny their biological reality and live in this fantasy land that, that they're somehow the same as biological females, which is a delusion.
All these ideas that trans athletes are somehow like physiologically or anatomically superior to their cisgender peers, show me the evidence.
There is evidence. There's multiple systematic reviews looking at trans women who have gone on hormone therapy and looking at the variables to see whether or not that hormone therapy has reduced the intrinsic biological advantages that come from being male and going through male puberty. And the evidence shows that the hormone therapy does not negate those advantages that are inherent to being male and inherent to going through male puberty. So, show you the evidence. How about you go fucking look up the evidence for yourself and just don't be lazy. Go on Google Scholar. You call yourself a doctor, you call yourself a researcher, go do the research yourself. The research exists. There's systematic evidence reviews out there. So go read them.
I don't see any. So all of this hysteria, it's just anti-trans. Okay. You ascribe or support simplistic, outdated, immutable definitions of sex. Even people who believe in the gender binary, they can't not say that they're like no intersex people, right? Like intersex people have been like around what, since forever? So like, why is it that people get so stuck with this gender binary thing? We also know that there's a difference between sex and gender. There just is.
So, the immutable definition of sex, which is used in the evolutionary sciences, which is used in the biological science to refer to sex, when we're talking about sex, when when a biologist is out in the field and they're studying a bird, for example, and the biologist says, "Look at that male bird over there." What do they mean when they say, "Look at that male bird over there"? They're referring to the gametes of the bird, whether the bird has small gametes or large gametes, whether their bodies have gone down a particular developmental pathway that organizes their body around the production of either small gametes or large gametes. That is what we mean by sex. That is what biologists means. That is what evolutionary theorists means. That is what sex is. That is the evolution of sex as a mechanism is the evolution of small gametes versus large gametes. There's not a third gamete. So there are two sexes, male and female. They're based on your gametes. That's what the science says. That's what the best science available says. And as far as we know, in humans, you cannot change that. Once you go down a pathway, you can't change that. And all these intersex things that they're talking about on the gamete account of small gametes versus large gametes, 99.99% of all intersex people, or all people, period, clearly fall into one or another of the male or the female category on the gamete account, small gametes or large gametes. So even on these intersex claims, because for example, like some of these intersex statistics say that if you have a micro penis, you are intersex. But clearly, if you have a micro penis, you're still male. A lot of these like variations are kind of like of that same sort. Where on the gamete account, you clearly know whether you're male or female, but you have some interruption in that natural developmental pathway in terms of like the development of these sexual characteristics. But we can still say very clearly whether you went down the male pathway or the female pathway when we're talking about gametes. And there are some edge cases, extremely rare edge cases, like 0.01%, where they have both tissues associated with testes tissue and ova tissue, in which case on the gamete account it might be ambiguous. But nevertheless, in these cases where you have both types of tissue, ova tissue and testes tissue, there's never been a reported case where both sets of tissue are equally functional. You're either infertile or one is functioning but not the other. So even in those cases, it's still pretty clear whether or not you're male or the female. And a binary categorization in the biological sciences that's 99.99%, clear cut, is about as clear cut as it gets. And so yeah, that is about as immutable and intractable and intrinsic as you could possibly want.
Is. And then both of these things, there's a spectrum. There's a spectrum of intersex people, there's a spectrum of gender identity and gender expression. So anyone who holds to this binary definition of sex and believes that, it's this and this alone that determines how one identifies, I'm sorry, that's just anti-trans. 7.
Apparently, acknowledging reality is anti-trans.
It's anti-trans to not support full access to gendered spaces based on identity. Many of these ridiculous laws that block trans people from accessing bathrooms or locker rooms that align with their gender identity seem to claim that transgender people are like there's a safety risk, that transgender people are going to go into these spaces and harm women or men. The reality is that transgender people are more likely than their cisgender counterparts to be assaulted in these spaces. Transgender people in general are more likely to experience violence against them. So this idea...
But male-bodied people are more likely to commit sexual crimes. And specifically, the transgender women, trans-identified males who are in prison, they're far, far more likely than the general population to be in prison for having committed a sexual crime. Upwards of 50% of all trans-identified males in prison are there for sexual crimes. So when we're talking about safeguarding of female spaces, safeguarding of these single-sex spaces, we're doing it in order to prevent the edge case. But right now, if a creepy man walks into a bathroom, the women in there are not allowed to say, hey, you don't belong in here, because that creepy man, they might be trans. Maybe they're just an early transition trans woman. They haven't shaved their beard yet. Who are you to say that they don't belong, as long as they have the identity? So they just identify as a woman. They just forgot to shave that morning, or they weigh 250 pounds of muscle, but they have an identity, so therefore can't say anything. They might be trans. And the response is like, well, those cases, those are overblown. That never really happens. But except all the cases where you do see trans women acting badly. For example, go on redux.com. You can see all these trans women acting badly. And also, given the reality of autogynephilia, given the reality that there are creepy AGP, fetishists out there, the purpose of safeguarding is to guard against the edge case. And being male, you have a statistically higher probability, regardless of whether you're trans or not trans, of being someone who commits a sexual offense. And so I think it behooves females to be able to regulate and manage their own spaces as they see fit. It should not be the case that, if you are a trans woman and you have a schlong, that you walk into the locker room, you just like drop trow and expose everyone. Well, if you have a gender identity that you're a woman, then you should be able to act just the same as any other woman in the locker room. But the mere fact that we all know intuitively that if you're a trans woman who still has a penis, you shouldn't walk into a locker room and expose that. Why? Because males do not belong in single sex changing spaces. And as a matter of pragmatism, we can't put detectors on every single door, so that the trans women who believe that they pass well enough are probably still going to use these spaces. But we have to empower the women in these spaces to regulate them and to push back and to kick people out who are creepy. And that's not anti-trans, that's just protecting female prerogatives. And I'm not a female, so this is not my you know fight to fight or whatever. But on the flip side, for males, a gay male space has a right to not allow a female into that gay male space. For example, if they want to have sexual activities and not worry about getting anyone pregnant, then they have a right to not have a female in that space. That's not anti-trans, that's wanting to protect the rights of males. Males have a right to exclusively hang out with other males, and females have a right to hang out exclusively with other females. That's just how it works. That's not anti-trans. That's just recognizing that in virtue of innate sex differences, typically, some people can get pregnant, some people can't. It makes sense to organize our social spaces and around that difference. That's not anti-trans.
That trans people are the safety risk? I'm sorry, that's ridiculous. It's anti-trans. Okay. 8, you believe there should be restrictions or limitations on those who medically, socially, or legally transition. So it used to be really hard for people to transition or to get the care that they needed. This resulted in many people either living in shame, hiding their identity, being miserable. So in some cases, it led to severe mental health outcomes and even suicide and death. Supporting people with easy access to gender affirming care really allows them to be the best people that they can be. We know that gender affirming care not only saves lives, but improves the overall well being of the individual. So if you support medicalized models that restrict access to gender affirming care, you're anti trans.
They basically just said if you have any role for gatekeeping whatsoever, then you're anti-trans. But like, we ought to be putting some restrictions on this, like some, making sure you're properly informed, because there's all sorts of stories of people who walk into Planned Parenthood, have a 30-minute consult, and then immediately get put on a testosterone prescription or whatever for estrogen. Like, that is too lenient. And while ultimately for adults, I'm a libertarian who thinks that as long as you're rationally informed of all like the possible risks and complications, that you should be able to do what you want to your own body. It's your own body as an adult. But we need to put some common sense restrictions on here, because these drugs are being handed out like candy in these like Planned Parenthood informed consent clinics. And and these are often vulnerable people who have comorbid mental health issues like autism or whatever. And for the male side, like a lot of these males, they don't even know the ultimate cause of why they're seeking out the services that they're seeking out. Like for example, they don't understand their own etiology of like, the fact that autogynephilia is at the root of their at the root of their gender dysphoria. And I feel like people are being pushed into these medicalized pathways without proper knowledge of all the risks and all the complications, and we just make it way too easy. And we need to put in way more gatekeeping, if not like 100% gatekeeping for the pediatric children, because I don't think you can give informed consent as a minor to these procedures. But even once you hit 18 to 25 or whatever, we need sensible gatekeeping, because if you're 18, you still might be subject to comorbid mental health issues that make it difficult for you to make a rational decision. So I don't think gatekeeping is bad. It's about, um, having some paternalism in our medical system. I don't think that I don't think that's inherently like a bad thing. So okay.
Okay. 9, you believe transgender people are mentally ill or that their exceptional gender qualities are the result of trauma and or autism. I am often called delusional or mentally ill on this channel. Sorry, honeys, I am not delusional or mentally ill, but I am trans. This idea, I also hear people say that, oh, being trans is the result of trauma. The reality is that trans people, gay people, are more likely to be.
So first of all, if you are a male-bodied person who's gone through puberty and you don't think that there's an intrinsic biological advantage in sports compared to females, then you are delusional. You are delusional about the reality of your male sex. In regards to like gender dysphoria being a mental illness or not, I've like talked about this on my channel quite extensively. And to me, if you are so unhappy with your body that you want to slice off your genitals, then like that is indicative of the fact that you have some sort of underlying mental health issues. Just like if someone really hated their leg and they wanted to cut off their leg, we would say that they have some mental illness. And even if they cut off their leg and then after the fact they're happy as a clam by the fact that they cut off their clam, we would still say that they have some underlying mental health issue in virtue of the fact that they had originally wanted to cut off their leg. That is just so why is the leg treated differently than the penis or the breast? They're not really that different, but we generally recognize that having a fundamental dislike of your healthy body tissue, your healthy, physiologically, medically healthy body, you are so unhappy with that medically healthy body that you want to have these radical interventions and like cut into and like distort and manipulate that flesh, that healthy body. That is indicative of an underlying mental health issue. And yet they still want to have gender dysphoria be a diagnosable disease, so that they can get the insurance coverage paying for it. Okay, so this person, they just had a vaginoplasty. Um, how did you get insurance coverage for that? If it's not it like wasn't a physical disease because your penis was presumably perfectly healthy and perfectly functional, so you didn't need to cut it off. It's not like you like ball cancer or something. So like so presumably if it's not a physical disease, it must be a mental disease. Otherwise, how could you possibly have gotten insurance coverage for this vaginoplasty that you just got? You have a mental health issue. And yeah, so there you go.
The victims of trauma, often because they're targeted for their exceptional orientations and expressions and identities. It's also true that within the neurodivergent population, compared to the rest of the population, there is a high proportion that identifies with a gender different than the sex assigned at birth. But within the transgender population as a whole, the proportion of individuals who are neurodivergent is small.
No, I think it's more like 30 to 40% for what I've seen. And this is particularly true for the young female adolescents who, very often they have autism. And if you listen to detransition narratives, you guys can see that a lot of the young female detransitioners, once they understood their autism, it helped them understand their gender dysphoria. And a lot of them talk about how their gender dysphoria was really a byproduct of their autism. And the male side, there seems to be this high correlation between autogynephilia and autism. And in terms of the causal story of like what caused what, it's not clear. There might be a third thing that causes both, or there might be interrelated causally. But it seems to me indicative of the fact that so many AGPs are autistic that there has to be some kind of mechanistic explanation there. So I don't know what that is, but I do think there's something more. It's not just pure correlation.
So this idea that neurodivergence leads to like being trans, it's just not accurate. And the science doesn't show that. Okay. And last but not least, number 10, believes in pathological, outdated models of gender identity, or that somehow trans people can be cured from being trans. Oh, honey, there is no cure for me.
Well, there's no cure for your underlying autogynephilia, but there is and also when we're talking about a cure, what we're often talking about is this idea that these gender nonconforming children in youth who, might grow on to develop a persistent trans identity, or they might just grow out of it, going through puberty is often such that 80% of these gender confused children, once they go through puberty, they desist, such that the puberty is the cure for their gender issues, for their gender troubles. Going through puberty, just letting the natural course of action go place, they often realize that they're in fact just gay men or women. You hear these stories all the time of like these older gay people who say that if they had grown up today in the modern trans identity ideology environment, they said they would have been pushed down the trans identity pathway. They would have been pushed to view themselves as trans kids. They go down the transition pathway, and how they're so happy that they grew up, in an earlier time before all this, like trans ideology stuff, because they just grew out of it. So this claim that if you're trans, you're born trans, you have an innate transness, some essence of you is trans, and you'll never not be trans, that's not really how it works. In reality, there's different degrees of gender nonconformity, and the extreme degree of gender nonconformity involves some confusion about identity, which is not that uncommon for gender nonconforming homosexual boys and girls. But often, if you just let them grow out of it, most of them will resolve their gender issues with time, and that's not, that's not like trying to like cure them or something. That's just like letting things happen on their own. And this is a good thing, because taking on the trans identity involves becoming a lifelong medical patient. We ought to support therapeutic interventions that can prevent you from potentially going down a lifelong medical pathway that is unnecessary from a physical medical perspective. Your body is physically healthy, so if we don't need to turn you into a lifelong medical patient, that is the preferable pathway, all things considered. And we should do everything in our power therapeutically to prevent you from becoming an unnecessary lifelong medical patient.
For this cuteness, right? So there are horrible histories of researchers, horrible stories and accounts of kids and adults, of conversion therapy, of attempt.
I think they're just talking about Kenneth Zucker. Zucker is not some terrible conversion therapist or whatever. He was just observing the fact that if you just let kids be themselves, these gender nonconforming, gender confused children often grow out of it. That's not him converting anyone. That's just like observing a fact of reality.
Attempts to change orientations, exceptional gender expressions and identities. And in many cases, these attempts have led to severe mental health outcomes and, suicide and death, basically. So, we need to stop trying to change people, and we need to actually work on accepting them.
Okay, so accept that when the little boy says that he likes dresses, accept him as a little boy and don't start trying to change him into a girl. Accept that he's just a boy who likes to wear dresses, or accept that it's a little girl who likes to play with trucks or likes to be a tomboy. Stop trying to turn tomboys into into actual boys. So yes, I agree. We need to like leave people alone and stop trying to change people. So when the boy comes out and says, "I like pink, I like dresses," don't try and turn him into a girl. Just let him be a gender non-conforming boy. And even if he says some confusing things about his own identity or his own sex, encourage him that no, just because you say those things, you're still a boy and you will always be a boy. So like, stop trying to change people. I agree.
If you feel like trans people can be cured, or that there's something wrong with trans people or gay people that needs to be changed, I'm sorry, you're just homophobic and anti-trans. It's just that simple. And also, these old pathological models of gender diversity that seem to be swirling around still, I will just say this. When the only people supporting your model are the same people who would erase and destroy the population that you're studying, maybe you should reconsider your theory or model and start listening to the actual individuals who your model affects, which are trans people. All right. So I hope this.
Okay, so that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.